Whispers of power echo through ancient forests, where white-robed figures once commanded kings and foretold destinies. The Druids, enigmatic priests who shaped Celtic civilization for centuries, wielded authority that made even Rome tremble. Journey through misty groves and sacred stones to discover how these mysterious figures judged disputes, guided rulers, and preserved cosmic knowledge through memory alone. Their blood-soaked sacrifices and prophetic visions struck fear into enemies. Yet their wisdom laid foundations for European law and literature. Though Roman swords and Christian crosses ultimately silenced their chants, their legacy endures. Experience the rise and fall of history's most legendary priesthood. Forests once stretched across the heart of Europe like an endless sea of green. Mist coiled among the oaks at dawn, and rivers carried their silver voices through valleys where the air felt thick with hidden presences. In this landscape, before Rome, before Greece had yet named its philosophers, the ancestors of the Celtic tribes took root. They were wanderers at first, hunters who followed herds across mountain passes, and herders who sought fresh pasture. But their movements carried more than survival. They transformed earth into story, sky into law, and the silent trees into companions of worship. Out of this wilderness rose a language that scholars would one day call Proto-Celtic, born from the great Indo-European tongue that had spread from the steppes to the Atlantic. Its words rang with thunder and water, echoing the landscapes that shaped them. Among those syllables lay one destined to endure: Druids, oak knowledge. To the people who coined it, the oak was not merely timber, but endurance itself. Its roots pierced the underworld, its trunk anchored the present, its crown touched the heavens. To know the oak was to understand time and the patience of centuries. From that phrase would grow the title Druid, though in this early dawn it was not yet spoken as such. What existed instead were the shadows of a role, men and women who bore memory like a burden and listened to forests and skies with a depth beyond ordinary hearing. Centuries passed, and those scattered clans began to leave traces of order. Around the lakes and salt mines of Hallstatt in modern Austria, communities of the early Iron Age carved their existence out of earth and stone. Torches lit their descent into mountain caverns, where miners cut veins of glittering salt, the treasure that preserved both food and wealth. When death claimed them, they buried their kin with swords, brooches, cauldrons, and wagons, objects meant to carry status and story into another world. Archaeologists who later uncovered these graves found not the remnants of a scattered folk, but the signs of a people already rich in ritual, bound by law, and practiced in forging meaning into every tool of daily life. Hallstatt's culture expanded along Europe's arteries of trade. Amber glowed in necklaces that had travelled from the Baltic. Greek pottery bore images of distant gods into Celtic strongholds, and wine jars from Etruscan vineyards arrived at feasts where warriors lifted their cups to ancestral songs. By the 5th century BC, this web of exchange had grown into what scholars name the Latène culture. Its art refused the rigid geometry of Mediterranean order, preferring the coils of serpents, the spirals of vines, the fluidity of water-made metal. The Celts had become a tapestry of tribes, each distinct yet bound by shared tongue, shared gods, and reverence for the unseen mysteries of the land. Feasts in timber halls revealed more than appetite. At the height of celebration, singers stood to chant genealogies that stretched kingship back to divine origins. In sacred clearings, robed figures raised their arms to the heavens and read omens in the flight of birds or the entrails of beasts. No chronicler yet called them Druids, but the shape of that role was already emerging. They were the keepers of memory, the ones who gave voice to the divine, the counselors whose words could crown a ruler or doom him. On the continent, particularly across the Rhine, Celtic tribes grew powerful. They built oppida, fortified hilltop settlements that commanded valleys and trade routes. Kings ruled with spears, yet their authority leaned heavily on counselors whose wisdom gave legitimacy. A ruler might command armies, but only a seer could reveal which day to march. Only a singer could bind victory to memory. Only a judge could settle disputes in the name of ancestral law. Slowly, a spiritual class coalesced, distinct from the warriors and the craftsmen. From them, in time, the Druids would rise. Across the storm-swept Channel, Britain absorbed these traditions. When Celtic chieftains carried their speech and symbols to the island, they found a land already scarred with ancient monuments. Stone circles like Avebury and the long-shadowed pillars of Stonehenge had stood silent for 1,000 years, their builders forgotten. Yet to the newcomers, such places could only be sacred. They folded the megaliths into their own cosmology, aligning their festivals and rituals with stones that caught the solstice sun. Oak groves and hilltops became stages for ceremony, and in them proto-Druids stepped forward as mediators between land and people. The Celtic migrations carried their imprint farther still. Warriors rode into Iberia, founding tribes remembered as Celtiberians. Others marched east until Galatian warbands settled in Asia Minor, startling Hellenistic kings with their ferocity. These journeys spread more than weapons. With them traveled the vision that every river bore a spirit, every mountain guarded its people, every tree whispered of the divine. Seers and singers accompanied the armies, ensuring that conquest did not only seize land, but also wove new territory into the fabric of sacred meaning. At this early stage, the figures who would one day be called Druids did not confine themselves to temples or cloisters. They appeared at feasts, binding kings to the past through song. They stood beside wounded warriors, invoking herbs and charms for healing. They presided over disputes where cattle, borders, or honor were at stake, speaking verdicts believed to carry ancestral sanction. At dawn, they watched the skies, charting the moon's course, tracing the dance of stars, and predicting when eclipse or solstice would bend the heavens into revelation. Their authority grew not from steel, but from vision, the conviction that they alone could interpret the hidden currents that ruled both gods and men. Fragments of older Indo-European cosmology lay within their grasp. The world tree that connected heaven, earth, and underworld remained alive in Celtic imagination, reflected in their reverence for oaks and groves. Cycles of sacrifice and rebirth shaped their rituals, binding death to life as part of an eternal exchange. Fire was transformation, water a passage into other realms, and the seasons themselves a breathing cosmos, whose pulse they could feel. Such knowledge set them apart, marking them as guides, mediators, and judges of time itself. The power of these proto-Druids reached beyond religion. Kings relied on them to determine auspicious moments for war. Farmers sought their counsel for planting and harvest, and entire tribes accepted their arbitration in disputes. Through their voices, law became sacred, no longer merely custom, but a reflection of the world's deeper order. To defy them was to defy the ancestors, the gods, and the very fabric of the universe. Thus, the dawn of the Celtic peoples was also the dawn of the Druids, not yet the fully formed order that Rome would one day fear and persecute, but already something more than ordinary men and women. They were oak knowers, wisdom keepers, figures who carried both the terror of prophecy and the balm of memory. Standing between myth and history, they prepared the ground for centuries in which their presence would guide, judge, and enchant. The forests whispered, the rivers carried their voices, and the oaks remembered. Out of that memory, the Druids were waiting to be born. Assemblies of the Celtic tribes were never silent affairs. Spears glinted in the sun, cattle bellowed in pens set aside for sacrifice, and chieftains raised their voices in disputes over land, honor, or blood price. Yet above the tumult, another authority commanded attention. When a figure in white raised a hand, warriors fell still. It was not the threat of steel that subdued them, but the conviction that the gods themselves spoke through human lips. Out of such moments grew the class that would dominate Celtic spiritual and political life, the priesthood of the Druids. Their order did not appear fully formed. It was shaped across centuries, drawn out of older strands of shaman, poet, judge, and healer. What emerged was a hierarchy remembered in Greek and Roman accounts, but long established before foreign eyes ever recorded it. At the peak stood those later called Druids, judges and philosophers, whose words could crown or unmake kings. Alongside them worked the Vates, keepers of ritual and masters of divination, their gaze fixed on fire and entrails, the sky at dusk, the trembling of leaves in the wind. Completing the triad were the bards, the poets whose songs preserved the past and whose verses gave shape to glory or shame. Together, they formed a lattice through which Celtic society understood itself. Memory, ritual, and judgment fused into a single institution. Becoming one of these figures was no simple calling. An initiate did not merely recite verses. He, or sometimes she, entered a lifetime of training that demanded both endurance and transformation. In groves where the light fell green through oak leaves, students learned chants that bound the seasons together. On lonely headlands, they were taught to watch stars trace their paths across the heavens until night skies became books of prophecy. Memory was the crucible. Verses stretched into the thousands, and each line had to be carried without error, for sacred knowledge could not be entrusted to ink or parchment. Writing was for merchants and kings, but the words of the gods demanded the living vessel of the human voice. To forget was a sin, to remember was survival. Such devotion set them apart. While farmers bent over fields and warriors followed the summons of their lords, the Druids walked free of taxation and military burden. Their exemption was not charity, but recognition. Kings and tribes understood that those who read the will of the divine must not be distracted by plough or spear. Offerings supported them, land was granted to their families, and schools rose where initiates could be drilled in the long labor of learning. Authority followed naturally from privilege, for in societies that measured power in cattle and swords, the Druids commanded wealth in the form of wisdom, something no raid could steal, no famine diminish. At great tribal gatherings, this authority was plain. Chieftains might bluster and warriors might threaten, but all awaited the word of the priests. If the Druids declared a boundary sacred, no warrior dared cross it. If they judged a quarrel between tribes, the verdict was binding, and if one was excommunicated, cast out from ritual, and denied participation in the feasts of the gods, the sentence was worse than exile or death. To be cut from ceremony was to be cut from the tribe itself, to wander without belonging, cursed in life and forgotten in death. Their influence extended even into the field of battle. Ancient accounts tell of Druids striding between opposing armies, their chants rising like thunder, halting combat before blood was shed. Whether embellished or true, such stories reflect the belief that their voices could bend even the fury of warriors. To fight against their prohibition was not only disobedience, but sacrilege, a violation of the natural order itself. Women were not absent from these ranks. In Ireland especially, tales recall the Bandrui, female druids whose visions guided kings and whose spells shaped battles. They appear in sagas as seers of destiny, midwives of sovereignty, and keepers of mysteries tied to land and fertility. Their presence confirms that Druidic wisdom was not a closed brotherhood, but a current that flowed where talent and discipline allowed. Behind their public roles lay disciplines hidden from ordinary eyes. They fasted in sacred groves, seeking dreams through hunger. They observed the flight of ravens at dawn, reading in their movements the verdicts of the gods. They studied the healing of herbs gathered at moonlight, whispered words of power over springs and rivers, and calculated the pattern of eclipses with a precision that startled Roman commentators. To become a druid was not simply to master knowledge, but to see the world differently, every star a sign, every tree a witness, every stone a marker of the divine. Kings both relied on and feared them. Without a druid's sanction, no ruler's crown sat comfortably. Without their blessing, no war seemed safe. Yet the same voice that confirmed a king's rule could whisper doubts into the ears of his rivals. Their power rested not on swords, but on conviction, and conviction can unseat thrones. This uneasy balance defined Celtic politics as much as raiding or diplomacy. Crown and grove lived in a state of mutual dependence, each unable to thrive without the other, each wary of being overshadowed. For the common people, druids were the guardians of cycles that marked their lives. Festivals bore their stamp. Beltane fires leapt under their direction. Samhain veils were thinned through their chants. Midwinter fires burned with prayers that they composed. The rhythms of farming and family life echoed the greater rhythms that druids interpreted, reminding every household that their toil was part of a cosmic order. Wealth, wisdom, ritual, and fear, these were the pillars upon which their order rested. They were more than priests. They were arbiters of fate, custodians of law, memories keepers, and interpreters of the divine. In an age when tribes clashed and borders shifted like sand, their authority endured. Warriors died, kings rose and fell, but the druids remained, carrying with them the one treasure no enemy could plunder, the power of knowledge made sacred. At the heart of the Celtic imagination lay the landscape itself. Mountains that cut across horizons, rivers that coiled like serpents through valleys, and above all, the forests, dense, ancient, and filled with presences too powerful to ignore. It was in clearings beneath towering oaks that druids found their most hallowed sanctuaries. No stone walls enclosed these spaces, no roofs shielded them. The sky, the wind, the shifting light between branches became the very temple in which sacrifice and prophecy unfolded. The oak dominated these groves, not by chance, but by meaning. Its timber resisted storms, its crown soared higher than all others, and its acorns fed both beasts and men. To gather beneath such a tree was to stand at the axis of the cosmos, where underworld, earth, and heaven converged. Pliny the Elder would later describe the ceremony of cutting mistletoe with a golden sickle. Druids dressed in white, cattle sacrificed beneath the branches. His account may have been coloured by Roman imagination, yet even as propaganda, it captured something essential: the conviction that life itself pulsed most fiercely where oak and sky met. Water carried equal sanctity, springs that welled from limestone hills, rivers that tumbled down from mountains, and lakes that lay still as mirrors were treated as thresholds between worlds. Offerings sank into their depths, swords, torques, cauldrons, sometimes the bodies of men and women given to the gods. Archaeologists have pulled treasures from rivers like the Thames or lakes in Ireland, their craftsmanship so fine that no practical reason could explain their loss. Wealth of such scale was surrendered because these waters were not simply rivers and lakes. They were mouths to the divine, places where gift and plea might pass into unseen hands. Stone carried memory in a different register. Long before Celts set foot in Britain, circles of standing monoliths marked the land. By the time Druids gazed upon Stonehenge or Avebury, those monuments were already ancient, their builders forgotten. Yet silence does not strip power. The great trilithons that framed the midsummer sun or the winter solstice moon appeared to the Celtic imagination as works of predecessors who had also known the movements of heaven. Whether or not Druids performed rites among those stones, their presence in oral tradition reveals how the megaliths were drawn into the religious landscape, a legacy absorbed rather than ignored. Time itself was measured within these sacred landscapes. The Coligny calendar, a fragmentary bronze tablet found in Gaul, testifies to a system of reckoning far more intricate than mere observation of harvests. Months of 29 or 30 days, intercalary corrections, festivals fixed by lunar cycles, all reveal a people who understood that ritual must move in harmony with celestial order. Druids were the interpreters of this cosmic rhythm, declaring when to light fires at Beltane, when to feast at Lugnasad, when the dead walked at Samhain, and when the first milk of spring at Imbolc promised renewal. Festivals turned the year into a circle of fire and shadow. On the eve of May, hilltops blazed with Beltane flames, cattle driven between twin fires to purify them for summer pasture. At Samhain, darkness thickened, and the veil between living and dead was said to thin, allowing ancestors to walk among their kin. Lugnasad honored the god Lugh with feasting and athletic games, a thanksgiving for harvest and a pledge to survive the coming cold. Imbolc, at winter's edge, brought prayers to Brigid for fertility of flock and field. Each festival bound community to cosmos, tribe to tribe, all under the guidance of the priesthood. Plants, too, became companions of ritual. Mistletoe gathered from the oak was revered for its rarity, a plant that grew in the branches without touching soil. Vervain and Selago were cut at dawn with elaborate precautions, believed to heal wounds and ward against evil. Water trefoil, harvested from marshes, was used in potions to still fever or stir vision. Whether or not all of these cures held true, the very act of ritualized gathering transformed the herb into something more than plant. It became medicine sanctified by rite. Not only plants, but objects carried power. Roman writers spoke of the serpent's egg, a curious talisman said to be formed when serpents intertwined and produced a stone-like sphere. Pliny dismissed it with skepticism, yet such tales reveal the magical imagination that infused Celtic practice. To hold such an object was to grasp not just curiosity, but authority, a token believed to confer victory in disputes or protection in battle. Above all, these rituals shaped a cosmology where nature itself was divine. There was no need for marble temples or idols of bronze, for the sacred was already inscribed in river, tree, and stone. The grove was both cathedral and cosmos, the year's festivals both scripture and liturgy. To participate in these rites was to live in harmony with a universe that breathed, bled, and renewed itself in endless cycle. Seen from the outside, such practices could appear alien or even terrifying. To the Romans, who raised altars of stone and carved their gods in human likeness, the Celtic refusal to contain divinity within images seemed both primitive and unsettling. Yet to the Celts themselves, this was reverence in its purest form, worship without walls, knowledge without book, a faith written on sky and soil rather than parchment. It was in these groves and circles, before fires and beneath stars, that the Druids gained their true authority. They were the interpreters of signs, the choreographers of festivals, the keepers of time's rhythm, the healers who knew which plant to cut and when. Their power was not abstract, but tangible, woven into every field sown, every feast shared, every year turned. Through them, the natural world became more than backdrop. It became the living scripture of a people. Gaul stood at the crossroads of Europe. Rivers like the Rhone and the Seine carried merchants from the Mediterranean deep into its valleys, while forests stretched so vast that Roman writers called them endless. Within this landscape lived dozens of tribes, each with its own chiefs and warriors, yet bound by common language, law, and belief. Among them, the Druids reached their fullest authority, shaping not only religion, but the fabric of governance itself. Foreign observers were struck by the extent of their influence. Julius Caesar, who would one day lead legions into these lands, wrote that nearly every public and private matter was referred to the Druids for judgment. Though Caesar's words were not free from political purpose, they echo older accounts by Posidonius, a Greek philosopher who travelled among the Celts and left impressions that survive through Roman quotations. To both, the Druids appeared not as village priests, but as the supreme arbiters of law, philosophy, and education across the region. Learning in Gaul was a formidable undertaking. Students trained for decades, memorizing verses that spanned cosmology, law, and poetry. Their masters forbade writing, claiming that sacred knowledge must be carried in living minds. Oral transmission made memory into discipline, turning the student's mind into a vessel capable of holding libraries worth of wisdom. Such training created a bond stronger than family, linking initiates to their teachers and to the long chain of tradition that reached back into forgotten centuries. Few could rival the wealth and influence held by this priestly class. Free from taxation and military burden, they possessed both time and resources. Kings and nobles offered land and wealth in exchange for counsel, creating estates that supported Druidic schools. Wealth was not displayed in palaces or jewelry, but invested in authority, in the capacity to preserve and transmit wisdom that no warrior's sword could threaten. To control knowledge was to control destiny. Their authority extended into politics. When tribes gathered in great assemblies to debate alliances or resolve disputes, Druids presided as judges. Their verdicts could prevent wars or sanction them. Banishment from their rights was the harshest punishment, stripping an offender of status and kinship. Such a sentence condemned a man to invisibility, for without the blessing of the Druids, no tribe would offer him hospitality, and no gods would hear his prayers. This power of exclusion gave the priesthood a leverage no king could match. Beyond judgment, they served as educators. Aristocratic families sent their sons to learn under the Druids, ensuring that future rulers were steeped in the lore of gods and ancestors, the rhythm of festivals, and the intricacies of law. To be trained in a Druidic school was to receive not only education, but initiation into a worldview that placed the cosmos, the tribe, and the gods in one continuous chain. Kings might inherit their rule, but they relied upon Druids to legitimize it. Their understanding of time revealed sophistication that startled outsiders. The Coligny calendar, unearthed centuries later in a Gallic field, bears testimony to their astronomical precision. Crafted in bronze, it divides months into cycles of 29 or 30 days, aligning lunar rhythm with solar year through intercalations. Such knowledge was not abstract astronomy, but practical authority. Farmers sowed, warriors marched, and festivals blazed in fire according to their calculations. To err in such reckonings would have been to misalign tribe with cosmos, a risk no ruler could afford. Roman and Greek witnesses often painted the Druids with a mixture of fascination and suspicion. Posidonius admired their philosophy, likening them to Pythagoreans for their belief in the immortality of the soul and the transmigration of spirits. Others saw them as dangerous, wielding an influence that rivaled secular rulers. Strabo described their role as not merely priests, but philosophers and scientists, men whose knowledge of nature and divinity gave them command over both law and custom. Still, the reliability of these sources is difficult to measure. Caesar, eager to justify his conquest, emphasized their role in sanctioning human sacrifice. Pliny, writing in Rome's comfort, described their rituals with both awe and scorn. Each outsider filtered what he saw or imagined through Roman expectations. Still, even through distortion, the scale of Druidic power in Gaul emerges clearly. They were the binding force across tribal divisions, the court of last appeal, the living archive of law, science, and theology. Through trade, their power carried across distances. Gaul controlled routes that connected the Mediterranean to the North Sea, moving wine, salt, amber, and slaves. Druids, exempt from tolls and deeply enmeshed in the aristocratic networks that governed commerce, gained influence in these exchanges. Their sanction lent legitimacy to agreements, while their presence ensured that trade moved not only goods, but also ideas, beliefs, symbols, and rituals carried across rivers and frontiers. The image of white-robed priests chanting beneath oaks belongs as much to imagination as to record, yet it captures a truth. Gaul was the stage on which the Druids attained continental prominence. They stood at the side of kings, guided the timing of war, guarded the archives of law, and educated the heirs of nobility. Their presence transformed a patchwork of tribes into a culture bound not only by blood, but by shared memory and shared ritual. By the time Roman legions marched into Gaul, the Druids were no marginal priesthood. They were the intellectual, judicial, and spiritual heart of the Celtic world. Rome could defeat armies in the field, but it understood that to rule Gaul, it would have to confront and ultimately dismantle the authority of the Druids. That contest was still to come, but already the priesthood had reached its zenith, a power that stretched beyond tribe and kingdom into the very fabric of life itself. The Channel was no wall. Narrow seas carried merchants, warriors, and students back and forth, binding Britain to Gaul in a constant rhythm of exchange. Traders brought wine jars and jewelry. Chiefs forged alliances through marriage, and among these travelers came young men destined for the groves of learning. They crossed the waters to sit at the feet of renowned masters, and returned years later carrying not only verses and rituals, but the authority of distant knowledge. Thus, Britain was never cut off from the continent. It was a partner in the same web of tradition. And yet, on this island, the role of the Druid would take on a sharper edge, one that made them both revered guardians of law and dreaded voices of resistance. Imagine a tribal assembly on a high plain, wind sweeping across the grass as warriors lean upon their spears. Chiefs sit in a ring, their cloaks pinned with brooches of bronze, each man surrounded by the loyal glare of his retainers. In the center, a quarrel is laid before the people, perhaps a dispute over cattle driven onto another's pasture, or a feud that has spilled blood between kin. 'Tis not the warriors who settle the matter. The Druids step forward, robed not in finery, but in the authority of memory and ritual. They recite precedents remembered from generations past, weigh the honor price owed for each offense, and deliver judgment with a finality that none dare dispute. To disobey their ruling would mean exile from the rites, and to be cut off from sacrifice and festival was worse than outlawry. It was erasure from the tribe itself. From such assemblies, the priests moved into landscapes marked by silence and awe. Britain was rich in groves where oak and ash towered above the undergrowth, and it was here, not in temples of stone, that rites unfolded. To walk into such a clearing at dusk was to step into another order of reality. Torches glimmering against bark, chants rising and falling with the wind, offerings laid at the roots where earth swallowed them whole. Water shared the same sanctity. Rivers carried gifts of weapons and ornaments. Lakes swallowed cauldrons of bronze. Wells received coins whose shine was meant for unseen eyes. These acts were not hidden. They were performed under the direction of Druids, turning landscape itself into a living scripture. Ancient monuments added another layer of mystery. By the time the Celts arrived, circles of stone like Avebury and Stonehenge were already older than memory. Their builders were forgotten, yet their alignments remained. At midsummer dawn, the first shaft of light pierced between trilithons, and in midwinter darkness, the moon's glow slid across the stones. To the island priesthood, such moments were proof that the cosmos itself bore witness to their craft. They were the interpreters of heaven's rhythm, the keepers of a calendar that determined when cattle should be moved, when festivals should blaze, when armies might march. If the stars gave a dark verdict, even the boldest chief thought twice before raising his banners. The seasons turned under their guidance, and each turning was marked with fire. On the eve of May, hilltops erupted in Beltane flames. Families drove their cattle between twin fires, smoke curling around horns and hides to purify the herds for summer pasture. Children laughed and leapt across the embers, while priests chanted blessings that bound prosperity to the coming months. Half a year later, as October's end brought long nights, Samhain arrived. Hearths were darkened and then rekindled from communal fire. Food was left upon doorsteps, for the Druids taught that the dead walked that night, returning to their kin while the veil was thinnest. To live through these festivals was to move through a rhythm deeper than mere agriculture. It was to step into the great breathing of the cosmos itself. From festival fire, it was but a step to the fire of war. When rival tribes prepared for battle, chiefs summoned Druids to read the omens. A raven circling overhead, the sudden flare of flame, the trembling of entrails in a sacrificial beast, all were signs interpreted by the priests. Without their blessing, no campaign felt secure. Roman writers tell of Druids stepping between opposing lines, arms raised, voices chanting words that bound warriors in sudden hesitation. Whether literal or embroidered, such accounts reveal a common truth. In Britain, war was never merely a contest of arms, but a rite whose outcome depended on the sanction of those who claimed to speak for the gods. Their authority made them both indispensable and feared. Kings needed them for legitimacy, yet dreaded their power to withdraw support. A ruler crowned without druidic blessing risked rebellion. A chief who defied their judgment faced exile from the sacred. This delicate balance bound politics and priesthood into uneasy partnership. Where warriors fought for land and cattle, the Druids fought for memory, for law, for the right to define the rhythm of time itself. Resistance to foreign power became their most dramatic role. When Rome first probed Britain's shores, it found not only tribes divided by rivalry, but a priesthood that could draw them together in common cause. Tacitus, writing of the conquest of Anglesey, describes Druids standing on the shore, arms raised, hurling curses at advancing legions. The image may be colored by rhetoric, yet it captures the essence of their power, to embody the spirit of the land itself, defying steel with words, turning ritual into resistance. Rome could slaughter warriors and topple kings, but until the priesthood was broken, the island would never be fully conquered. For ordinary people, Druids were not distant figures. They were the ones who blessed the fields at planting, who healed wounds with herbs cut under moonlight, who declared peace between feuding neighbors, who preserved the tales of heroes in song. Their presence stretched from the hearth to the battlefield, from cradle to grave. Life itself was a tapestry woven through their rites. Thus, Britain became the place where the Druidic role was carried to its greatest intensity. Here they presided over assemblies, commanded the rhythm of festivals, read the will of the heavens, and stood as the voice of a people against the encroaching empire. They were not mere priests, but the sinews that bound tribe to tribe, past to present, earth to sky. And yet Britain was not the only stronghold of their power. Beyond the western sea lay Ireland, untouched by Rome's legions. There the Druids flourished not only in the courts of kings, but in the pages of myth, their voices ringing through sagas of magic and prophecy. If Britain made the Druids guardians of resistance, Ireland would make them immortal in story. Ireland lay west of the stormy channel, a land of rolling hills, shadowed bogs, and rivers flashing beneath unsettled skies. Unlike Gaul or Britain, this island never felt the tread of Roman legions. No emperor's decree silenced its rights. No foreign governor banned its sacrifices. Here, the Druidic order endured without interruption, flourishing in courts, assemblies, and ritual landscapes, until it became indistinguishable from the identity of the people themselves. In this Western Isle, Druids were not only counselors and philosophers, but also prophets and magicians, remembered in legend as figures who shaped the very destiny of kings and heroes. The tales preserved in medieval manuscripts, copied by monks long after Christianity had taken hold, still echo with that older world. Names rise from their pages like voices from mist. Cathbad, who prophesied the fate of Cu Chulainn before the boy ever raised a weapon. Emergin, the poet of the Milesians, whose verses upon landing bent the sea and wind to his command. Mug Ruith, a wonder worker said to soar through the sky in a stone chariot, his eyes glowing with fire. These characters are not historical in the modern sense, yet their survival reveals how powerfully memory associated the priesthood with magic, prophecy, and sacred authority. What makes Ireland distinct is the perspective. On the continent and in Britain, much of what we know comes through Roman eyes. Hostile, suspicious, quick to emphasize sacrifice and savagery. But here, the stories belong to the people themselves. Within them, Druids are not distant philosophers, but counselors seated beside rulers, judges whose words carried divine weight, and prophets whose visions altered the course of dynasties. At Tara, the ceremonial center of sovereignty, no king could reign without their sanction. Rituals joined the ruler to the goddess of the land, sometimes embodied by a woman who shared a sacred drink or ritual embrace. Sovereignty was a marriage between king and soil, and the priests were its witnesses. Without their blessing, rule was empty. With it, kingship became sacred covenant. Women themselves were counted among these wisdom keepers. The Bandrui, female druids, appear again and again in sagas. Some healed with herbs, others cursed enemies. Many spoke prophecies that guided armies and lovers alike. Brigid, later recast as a Christian saint, likely began as such a figure, patroness of fire, fertility, and poetry. Scathach, the legendary instructor of warriors in Scotland, bore traits that belonged squarely to the Druidic path: prophecy, magical skill, authority to shape fate. These women reveal that in Ireland, access to wisdom was not confined to men. Where discipline and knowledge were proven, authority followed, whether the voice belonged to priest or priestess. The rituals of this island could be stark, even unsettling. Stories tell of the triple death: strangulation, wounding, and drowning, a sacrifice to gods who demanded nothing less than completeness. For centuries, these were dismissed as medieval inventions, yet the bogs of the Emerald Shore have preserved bodies whose final moments bear eerie resemblance to the tales. Old Krogan man, buried with rope cuts around his neck. Clonnecovan man, struck down and deposited in watery peat. Others with wounds upon their flesh, carefully placed in liminal landscapes. These finds suggest that the sagas did not imagine cruelty, but recorded memories of ritual acts sanctified by time. Other practices reinforced this continuity. Irish myths often speak of severed heads, taken from enemies and preserved as trophies or even as oracles. Some accounts tell of shrines lined with skulls, grim repositories where the dead continued to speak through the mediation of priests. To hold an enemy's head was to hold his spirit, his essence. Druids were said to interpret the whispers of these relics, treating them as vessels of lingering wisdom. Outsiders recoiled from such customs, but within the Celtic imagination, they affirmed a world where life and death were permeable, where memory could be made flesh long after breath was gone. Prophecy filled these tales as richly as battle filled the fields. When Deirdre, the doomed heroine of Ulster legend, was born, Druids foretold that her beauty would shatter kingdoms. Kings tried to resist the prophecy, but their defiance only ensured its fulfillment. When young Sue Shullin took up arms, Cathbad declared that whoever armed that day would live gloriously yet die young. The boy seized his weapons anyway, and destiny followed him as shadow follows flame. Again and again, sagas depict the priesthood as speakers of fate, whose words could not be undone. To hear their prophecy was to receive a sentence written into the fabric of the cosmos. At the royal seats of Tara, Emain Masha, and Cruachan, their presence was constant. They advised rulers on matters of law, pronounced judgments in disputes, and blessed or condemned wars. Their authority turned brute kingship into sacral office. A chief might seize power with warriors, but only with druidic sanction did he rule as chosen of gods and land alike. In this way, the island priesthood acted as the hinge of legitimacy, ensuring that politics always moved within a sacred framework. Magic in these stories went beyond prophecy. Druids cloaked armies in fog, conjured storms that wrecked fleets, or transformed themselves into birds and beasts. These marvels belong partly to legend, yet they reflect the aura of power that clung to the order. Even when Christian scribes sought to discredit them, they could not erase their grandeur. Instead, they recast Druids as sorcerers, dangerous, misguided, but potent, proof that memory of their influence remained too strong to vanish. Because the island never fell to Rome, the order endured longer here than anywhere else. Schools of poetry, law, and ritual thrived well into the early medieval centuries. Bards preserved lineages and epics in verse. Brehons upheld legal codes rooted in ancient custom, and poets carried the echoes of sacred chants. When Christianity finally arrived, it did not find a void, but a formidable system of knowledge. Missionaries confronted an entrenched priesthood whose authority touched every sphere of life. Conflict was fierce, yet adaptation followed. Many of the oral traditions the Druids had guarded found new life in monastic scriptoria, transformed from forbidden memory into written heritage. The legacy of the Druids in Ireland is thus both historical and mythical. Archaeology offers the cauldrons pulled from lakes, the bog bodies with their ritual wounds, the sacred landscapes marked by offerings. Literature preserves the voices of seers and magicians, shaping the destinies of heroes and kings. Between the two emerges a portrait of a priesthood that stood at the very heart of society, commanding respect through judgment, prophecy, and ritual power. Where Britain gave the Roman world the image of white-robed priests cursing legions from Anglesea's shore, Ireland offered something stranger and more enduring. Here, free from conquest, the Druids became immortal in story, living on as prophets, magicians, and guardians of law. And from this land, their authority would take on its most lasting form, not only in myth, but in the very legal traditions that outlived them, shaping codes of justice well into the Christian era. On the crest of a low hill, cattle bellowed against their tethers, the smell of dung and summer dust rising in the air. Warriors leaned on their spears in a wide circle, waiting for violence to break loose. Two families stood at the center, their voices raw with accusation. A herd claimed by one as stolen, defended by the other as fairly won. Hands crept towards sword hilts. Women shouted their kinship ties, and for a moment the gathering teetered on the edge of bloodshed. Then a figure in white raised his staff, and silence spread across the assembly like a wave receding from the shore. The Druid recited names that reached back through generations, anchoring the quarrel in memory older than any living witness. He spoke of honor price, of the worth of a man measured not only in cattle, but in dignity, a value set by his rank within the tribe. His voice carried no weapon, yet when he declared the restitution, silver here, livestock there, the families lowered their heads in reluctant agreement. The herd was divided, fines set in motion, and what might have become a feud was transmuted into peace. Law, in the hands of the priests, was more than custom. It was the ordering principle of the universe itself. Such scenes were common on the island. On appointed days, tribes gathered at sacred places, open fields, ring forts, or hilltops, where the horizon stretched unbroken. The air filled with the sound of pipes, the chanting of poets, and the murmur of expectant crowds. These were not mere courts, but grand assemblies where law, religion, and politics converged. Poets stood to chant genealogies that confirmed rights, sacrifices smoked upon altars, and when judgment had been rendered, feasts followed, binding reconciliation with shared bread and meat. To attend such a gathering was to see society itself laid bare, quarrels, kinship, worship, and justice interwoven under the eyes of the Druids. The sanction they wielded went beyond fines. To be cut off from ceremony was the gravest penalty, a living death. A man denied access to ritual fires and festivals became a ghost among his people. No one would trade with him, eat at his hearth, or bury his body in the ground of his ancestors. Some chose exile rather than endure such dishonor. In this way, the priests enforced justice not by sword, but by exclusion, a punishment feared more than wounds. Even the respect due to holy ground fell under their authority. Certain groves, wells, and hillsides were declared inviolate, places where no blood might be spilled. A fugitive who reached such a site stood under divine protection, and to violate that safety was to invite both social penalty and the wrath of the gods. These sanctuaries became the earliest asylums, binding law and mercy together in sacred landscape. Training to join this class was a lifelong endeavor. A youth might spend 20 winters learning under his master, memorizing verses so intricate that a single error could twist meaning. He learned through song, for law was not recited in dry monotone, but chanted in rhythms that etched themselves into memory. Each stanza contained precedents: the fine for striking a noble, the restitution for theft, the rules of inheritance and land. Knowledge was forbidden to be written down, for ink could not contain the sacred. Law lived only in human voices, passed from teacher to pupil like flame carried from torch to torch. Because the law was sung, poets shared in its custody. Their recitations reminded the people of ancestral agreements, kept memory sharp, and held rulers accountable. A judge who strayed from precedent could be lampooned in verse, his dishonor immortalized in rhyme. The interplay between priest, poet, and ruler created a balance of power rare in the ancient world. Kings wielded armies, but druids and bards controlled memory and judgment. Together, these forces bound communities more firmly than spears could. At the core of this system lay the idea of the honor price, the value of each life measured in wealth and status. Injuries were calculated not only in physical harm, but in insult to dignity. To strike a noble demanded vast compensation. To insult a farmer required less, but still a measurable fine. Even the humblest had a value set in law, a recognition that no life was beneath reckoning. This system did not erase hierarchy, it reflected it, but it also restrained violence, channeling revenge into restitution. Blood feud was not denied, but tamed, reshaped into a currency of peace. These judgments were not abstract principles, but living rituals. When a man paid his fine, cattle were driven before the crowd, their lowing a tangible reminder of justice restored. When silver changed hands, the gleam of metal affirmed the balance struck. Justice was visible, communal, and sacred. All who witnessed became part of the covenant, remembering the precedent and carrying it forward in song and story. Over time, the priestly judges became known as brehons, yet their lineage from the Druids remained clear. Both lived exempt from tax and military service, supported by patronage and land. Both preserved knowledge that set them apart from ordinary men, and both spoke with authority that transcended tribal loyalties, binding not just one clan, but entire regions under the same principles. Christianity would later polish the edges of this system, but its roots reached deep into the soil of Druidic tradition. At large assemblies, the scope of their influence became clear. Disputes over marriage, inheritance, or land were settled before the multitude, binding families to law through public witness. New treaties were sworn beneath their oversight, sacrifices sealing oaths with divine approval. Such gatherings functioned as both festival and court, weaving social cohesion through spectacle. The sight of druids seated at the center, speaking verdicts while warriors and nobles listened, affirmed that power in this land flowed not only from the sword, but from wisdom preserved in memory. To the common farmer, these laws meant protection against arbitrary violence. A man who lost a cow to theft could appeal for restitution. A woman injured in quarrel could claim her honor price. Even children were accounted for, their value measured so that harm to them demanded redress. Justice here was not abstract, it was measured in the stuff of daily life: cattle, silver, grain, and service. In this way, the Druids bound cosmic order to practical reality. As Christianity advanced, monks began to record these traditions in manuscripts. Though stripped of explicit pagan references, the structure remained intact. What had once been spoken under oak trees and memorized by firelight was now set down on vellum. The voice of the grove echoed through the scriptorium. its authority preserved even as the order that had first spoken it began to fade. The survival of these codes into written form testifies to their strength. While Gaul's priesthood was crushed beneath imperial power and Britain silenced by Roman conquest, the island across the Western Sea carried their wisdom forward. In its courts and poems, in its assemblies and feasts, the authority of the Druids endured, shaping not only myth but daily life. Thus, the legal role of the Druids reveals their deepest influence. They were not merely prophets or magicians, but lawmakers, peacemakers, and guardians of social balance. By binding justice to ritual and compensation to cosmic order, they created a system that restrained violence and sanctified peace. Their verdicts carried the weight of the gods, and in that fusion of law and faith lay their most enduring legacy. Even as their order declined, the structure they built lived on, ensuring that their voice continued to shape the island long after the groves fell silent. When Julius Caesar led his legions across the Rhone and into the valleys of Gaul, he did not find an unstructured wilderness, but a world already thick with custom, law, and ritual. Behind the banners of the tribes stood not only warriors, but the voices of their priests, men in white, who spoke judgments and declared when the gods favored war. To conquer the land, Caesar had to conquer its memories, and those memories were kept by the Druids. In his Commentari de Bello Gallico, the general offered the most detailed description of their order ever set down by Roman hand. He wrote of a priesthood that presided over disputes, taught philosophy, and guarded the sacred knowledge of the cosmos. Students, he claimed, flocked to them from every corner of Gaul, remaining 20 years in training, memorizing verses that explained the movements of the stars, the nature of the gods, the structure of the world. Knowledge was never entrusted to writing, but preserved in living memory, recited and corrected until it formed a chain unbroken across generations. Caesar's admiration, however, was tangled with calculation. He painted them as philosophers, yet also as guardians of practices Rome found abhorrent. Most infamous was his claim that they sanctioned human sacrifice, sometimes by burning victims within vast wicker figures. The image of screaming prisoners consumed by fire was repeated by later writers, becoming one of the most enduring symbols of Druidic ritual. Whether such spectacles were common or carefully exaggerated is uncertain. Archaeological finds of bog bodies and ritual killings confirm that human offerings did occur, but the colossal wicker man may have been a Roman invention, crafted to shock audiences back home and justify conquest under the guise of moral duty. In truth, Caesar needed both fascination and condemnation. By presenting the Druids as philosophers, he appealed to Roman readers curious about foreign wisdom. By portraying them as sacrifices of men, he provided a moral excuse for his campaigns. Conquest was not plunder, he implied, but the eradication of barbarous superstition. Thus, the Druids became both noble and savage in his account, mirrors for Roman imagination, more than reflections of reality. Other observers confirmed parts of his portrait. The Greek writer Posidonius, who travelled among the Celts a century earlier, described priests who speculated on the cosmos and taught that souls were immortal, passing after death into new bodies. This belief in transmigration, so reminiscent of Pythagorean philosophy, fascinated Mediterranean thinkers. It explained why Celtic warriors hurled themselves into battle without fear. Death was not an ending, but a passage. Strabo, another geographer, spoke of Druids as philosophers and judges, while also echoing tales of sacrifice. Through these voices, the priesthood appeared both lofty and terrifying, custodians of wisdom and keepers of rites alien to Roman sensibilities. To be taught by them was a privilege demanding respect. Caesar recorded that students were forbidden to write down sacred teachings, lest they weaken their memories or expose secrets to the uninitiated. Instead, knowledge was carved into minds through endless recitation. Astronomy, theology, law, and genealogy were mastered in this way, each discipline tied to ritual. The discipline produced men whose memories were living libraries, guardians of wisdom that outlived the fall of chiefs and the deaths of kings. The political power of the order alarmed Rome. Druids served as arbiters in disputes between tribes, their judgments binding across boundaries that otherwise bristled with hostility. To them, exile from ritual was the harshest punishment, severing a man from both community and gods. Such authority allowed them to restrain feuds and command peace. A priest could halt armies already drawn up for war, declare that the gods demanded restraint, and tribes would obey. For Caesar, who wished to bind Gaul beneath Rome, such independent power was intolerable. Even so, he also recognized the usefulness of their networks. Their schools stretched from Gaul to Britain, forming an invisible web of influence that transcended tribal politics. Capturing the allegiance of the priesthood could mean securing entire confederations. Suppressing them outright would provoke resistance, but co-opting their authority offered the promise of stability. Thus, Caesar's accounts are laced with contradiction. He feared their influence, respected their wisdom, and manipulated their image for Roman ends. The charge of human sacrifice remained his sharpest weapon. He described not only wicker figures, but the stabbing of criminals over altars and the drowning of victims in sacred lakes. Such tales, amplified by Roman propaganda, cast Gaul as a land drenched in blood. To destroy the Druids was therefore to bring civilization. And yet, the very luridness of these accounts suggests exaggeration. Rome itself practiced human sacrifice in its earliest days, and gladiatorial combat remained a ritualized slaughter for public spectacle. By condemning the Druids, Caesar also concealed the echoes of Rome's own past. What survives adds layers of uncertainty to the story. Bodies recovered from bogs in Gaul and Ireland show signs of strangulation, stabbing, and drowning, the triple death described in later Irish texts. Such offerings suggest that sacrifice was real, though likely far rarer and more solemn than Roman writers implied. Sacred lakes filled with votive weapons and ornaments testify to the scale of offerings, yet few contain evidence of mass immolation. The wicker man, so vivid in Caesar's pages, remains uncorroborated by the earth. Despite the distortions, the core of his testimony is consistent. The Druids of Gaul were philosophers, astronomers, judges, and priests, commanding authority beyond that of kings. They were the custodians of memory in a society without written archives, the interpreters of cosmic order, the mediators of law. Their independence threatened Roman control because their power rested not on armies, but on belief. To break Gaul, Rome had to break the trust people placed in their priests. This tension culminated as Caesar advanced his campaigns. Tribes divided between those who aligned with Rome and those who resisted under Druidic guidance. In his pages, one senses both frustration and awe. He faced not only swords, but a priesthood that bound together law, religion, and philosophy. Their words could inspire confederations, and their curses could stiffen resistance. By the end of the conquest, their power was visibly weakened. Roman governors distrusted them, emperors later outlawed them, and their schools withered under suppression. Yet in Caesar's account, their shadow loomed long after the last Gallic fortress fell. They embodied for him both the nobility and the savagery of the land he sought to subdue. His words immortalized them, even as his campaigns dismantled their influence. Thus, in Gaul, the Druids entered history as paradox. Philosophers compared to Greek sages, yet sacrificers accused of cruelty, judges who restrained violence, yet alleged instigators of bloodshed. Their memory comes to us filtered through conquest, recorded by those who wished both to admire and to destroy them. And in this paradox lies their enduring image, guardians of a world Rome both envied and feared. The tide of empire rolled across the Channel, and with it came the determination to finish what Caesar had begun. By the 1st century AD, Rome had subdued much of Gaul. Britain, however, still stood half-wild in Roman eyes, an island where priests in white robes whispered curses from sacred groves and marshlands. For the governors of the province, these figures were more dangerous than any warlord. They bound tribes together through ritual, preserved memory in defiance of imperial law, and offered resistance not only in arms, but in spirit. To secure the island, Rome resolved to destroy them. Tacitus, writing decades later, gives the most vivid account of the confrontation. In the year 60 or 61, while Boudicca's revolt raged in the east, the governor Suetonius Paulinus led a campaign against the island of Mona, Anglesey, off the northwest coast of Wales. This was no random target. Mona was remembered as a stronghold of the priesthood, a sanctuary where Druids had retreated as Roman power advanced. To strike here was to strike at the heart of their authority. Legions marched westward across mountains and rivers until they reached the Menai Strait. On the opposite shore, Tacitus tells us, stood a formidable sight: warriors armed with spears, women dressed in black with disheveled hair, and Druids raising their hands to heaven, chanting curses in voices that chilled even hardened soldiers. The Romans faltered. Superstition gripped them. Their shields trembled. Only when Suetonius urged them forward, reminding them of discipline and empire, did they surge into the waters and cross under a hail of stones and spears. The clash was fierce but brief. Roman steel cut through defenders, and once the shore was seized, the legions carried out a work of deliberate annihilation. Groves were cut down, altars toppled, sacred trees felled. Fire consumed shrines where sacrifices had once been made, and priests were put to the sword. Tacitus describes it as the destruction of barbarous rites, but the violence reveals more. Rome feared not just armies, but the ideas that sustained them. Bringing down the sanctuary on Anglesey was one step in a wider design. Wherever Rome advanced, it targeted sacred places. Groves along rivers were felled, holy wells defiled, assemblies broken up. The empire tolerated many foreign cults, but not this one. Druids were too independent, too entwined with law and resistance, too capable of uniting tribes against occupation. To conquer land, Rome needed to silence the voices that declared war unjust or cursed legions as violators of cosmic order. Evidence from the earth corroborates at least some of the grim images painted by Roman pens. Across Britain and Ireland, bog bodies preserved in peat show signs of ritual killing. Lindo Man, discovered in Cheshire, bore marks of strangulation, blows to the head, and a cut throat. A death that combined three forms of sacrifice. Tolland Man in Denmark and Clonachaven Man in Ireland reveal similar fates. These bodies, laid in watery graves that blurred the border between worlds, suggest that ritual killing was real, though its frequency and purpose remain debated. For Romans eager to brand the Druids as monstrous, such finds offered convenient confirmation. Even so, what terrified the empire was not sacrifice alone, but the authority behind it. Druids commanded assemblies, judged disputes, and declared who was fit to rule. They preserved traditions Rome could not control, and upheld loyalties deeper than any treaty with governors. To allow them to survive was to admit a rival power within the province. Suppression became policy. Under emperors like Claudius, decrees outlawed their practices. Across Gaul and Britain, schools closed, students dispersed, and those who persisted risked death. This memory of resistance endured. The image of white-robed priests chanting curses at Mona lingered in Roman imagination, passed from Tacitus to later generations. Even as Rome built roads, towns, and villas, the shadow of the Druids haunted the landscape, reminders that conquest was never fully complete. In remote hills and valleys, folk practices continued, offerings to rivers, fires on midsummer nights, charms muttered in the dark. The empire could cut down groves, but it could not silence belief. The war on Druids thus became symbolic. Rome prided itself on absorbing foreign gods, Isis from Egypt, Mithras from Persia, Cybele from Anatolia. But the priests of the Celts offered no compromise. Their authority rested not on temples. Rome could co-opt, but on memory, law, and land itself. To defeat them, the empire had to destroy, not adapt. The assault on Mona was therefore more than a military campaign. It was an attempt to erase an entire intellectual and spiritual tradition. Even in suppression, echoes survived. The Coligny calendar, fragments of which were later discovered in Gaul, hints at the precision with which they measured time. Oral tradition carried legal codes into the medieval period, transformed but still recognizable. Folk memory preserved images of seers who could shape destiny with words, healers who knew the power of herbs, prophets who read the sky. Rome may have crushed their public role, but in the imagination of the people, the Druids remained. By the end of the 1st century, organized Druidism in Britain was largely extinguished. Groves had been felled, priests executed, students scattered. Yet their defeat was never as total as Rome desired. The hills and rivers still carried whispers of their rights, and their memory endured in the sagas of Ireland, where no legion ever marched. From the ruins of Mona's groves to the bogs that preserved the dead, the traces of their power remained stubborn, defying even the empire that claimed to rule the world. In this way, the Roman war on the Druids was more than a clash of arms. It was the collision of two visions of authority, one rooted in cosmic law and ancestral memory, the other in imperial decree and military discipline. Rome could cut down the sacred oak, but the roots remained hidden in the soil, ready to sprout again in legend and story. And from those roots, the memory of the Druids would continue to grow long after the legions withdrew. By the turn of the 1st century, the sacred groves of Gaul no longer rang with chants that had once echoed through oak and ash. The Romans had not only defeated armies, they had struck at the priesthood itself, cutting down trees that stood as temples and silencing voices that had guided tribes for centuries. What followed was not a sudden disappearance, but a long fading, a twilight where memory lingered even as the order lost its place in public life. For a time, some priests sought to adapt. Families who had once raised their children to memorize verses and preside at assemblies now sent them into the service of governors and officials. The wisdom that had legitimized kingship was redirected into bureaucracy, keeping boundaries clear, mediating disputes, tallying the wealth of conquered towns. Where once they crowned rulers in fire-lit ceremonies, they now sat in civic halls, clothed not in white but in Roman wool. The transformation was not born of loyalty but of necessity. Survival demanded compromise, and compromise demanded disguise. Others turned inward, preserving fragments of ritual away from Roman eyes. Fires no longer blazed openly on hilltops. Yet villagers still carried torches at midsummer, leaping across flames to ensure health for the coming year. Children still heard charms whispered over fevers, verses whose words had shifted but whose cadence carried the weight of centuries. Wells were rededicated to Mercury or Mars, but the offerings dropped into their depths. Coins, brooches, food belonged as much to older gods as to new. The rites survived, only their names changed. The countryside clung stubbornly to its rhythms. In fields, farmers still timed their sowing and harvest with celestial cycles, though now they spoke of Roman gods when asked. Families gathered at midwinter to light fires that warded away the longest night, even as priests of the empire insisted such acts be given Christian meaning. The essence of the festival remained. The light would return, and with it, the promise of life. Rome could rename, but it could not erase. When Christianity spread across Gaul, the twilight deepened, but did not vanish. Bishops thundered from pulpits that the groves were cursed, the wells haunted, the festivals demonic. Yet the people continued. A well once sacred to a goddess became a spring of healing for a saint. A feast once dedicated to fire gods became a vigil for martyrs. Samhain, the night when souls wandered, transformed into All Saints' Eve. The goddess Brigid became Saint Brigid, her festival preserved, her attributes half remembered beneath Christian robes. In this way, the new faith conquered not by destruction alone, but by absorption, cloaking the old ways in the garments of the church. Still, resistance stirred beneath the surface. In Brittany, across the Western Sea, tales persisted of stones that bled when struck, wells that granted visions, and trees that demanded offerings of bread or milk. Villagers swore that poets still cursed in verse, that seers still spoke prophecies in darkened rooms. Though bishops condemned such acts, the people held to them, unwilling to surrender the bond between land and ritual. The empire could occupy towns, but fields and forests remained the people's own. Even in towns, memory clung stubbornly. Market days often coincided with older festivals, and what was sold and traded carried echoes of sacred exchange. Children's games mimicked rites once solemn, their songs repeating fragments of chants now stripped of meaning. Storytellers wove the memory of Druids into tales of heroes, sometimes casting them as wise men, sometimes as sorcerers, but always as figures of power who shaped destiny. Though their authority in courts and assemblies was gone, they lived on in imagination. Writers of later centuries recalled them as a people of vanished wisdom. They spoke of philosophers who speculated on the stars, of judges who bound tribes to justice, of priests whose words could halt armies. Their tone was often tinged with nostalgia, as if remembering an age when men spoke with gods more directly than in their own time. Others wrote with contempt, describing them as charlatans or magicians. But even in disdain, they acknowledged that memory had not been erased. The Druids had passed into the realm of legend, but legend itself carried weight. Among the common folk, their influence lingered in smaller ways. Families still sought guidance from wise men and women who knew the herbs of the fields. The prayers that soothed childbirth, the verses that stilled storms. These were no longer Druids in the formal sense, but their role was the same, mediators between people and the forces that governed life. A charm muttered over a sick child, a stone left at a crossroads, a fire lit at the new year. All were acts that bound the present to a memory older than Rome. The twilight was long, stretching across generations. Each year saw less open ritual, fewer men trained in the old verses, yet also saw continuity disguised in new forms. The priesthood vanished as an institution, but the soil of Gaul still bore the imprint of their authority. In village festivals, in folk belief, in whispered stories by hearthfire. Their presence endured. Rome had toppled their groves, and the church had condemned their names. But the memory of their power clung to the land like mist on a river. By the early medieval period, the Druids had vanished from Gaul as living figures. Yet they had not disappeared entirely. Their lore had seeded itself in custom, their rituals in festivals, their memory in story. Even as bishops claimed the mantle of spiritual authority, the people remembered that once there had been another class who spoke for the gods. And across the sea, on the island of Ireland, that class was not memory, but reality, still alive in courts and in song. What came over Gaul was no abrupt nightfall, but a slow, lingering twilight. Slowly, steadily, the priests of oak and star slipped into shadow, leaving behind echoes rather than silence. Their names became legend, their rites became custom, their lore became story. And in this transformation lay their survival. Though gone as a public power, they endured as memory, shaping the imagination of a people long after their groves had been cut down. While Gaul slipped into dusk and its priesthood became only a memory, Ireland glowed with a different light. Across that western sea, where no legion marched and no imperial governor imposed decree, the Druids endured. Their voices still rang in the halls of kings, their prophecies shaped the lives of heroes, and their schools preserved the verses that bound lore, ritual, and story together. Where on the continent their kind had faded into legend, here they remained flesh and blood. At Tara, seat of the High Kings, Druids stood beside rulers during the rites of inauguration. The king did not sit on the throne until the priests declared the land had accepted him. Ritual drinks sealed the covenant, sometimes described in tales as a mystical union between king and goddess, overseen by those who claim knowledge of cosmic order. Without their sanction, kingship was incomplete, a crown without legitimacy. With it, the ruler was not merely a man with power, but the embodiment of sovereignty itself. The sagas of the Ulster cycle show the priesthood at its most vivid. When the boy Shu Shulin first took up arms, it was Cathbad who declared the prophecy: glory and youth, or long life without fame. The boy chose the path of brilliance, and the seer's words became destiny. Time and again in the stories, Druids step forward as arbiters of fate, their pronouncements binding even kings to inevitability. To hear their voice was to learn the shape of one's life, whether welcome or terrible. As for the Bandrui, female Druids were no less present. They appear in sagas as healers, teachers, and prophets. Scathach, who trained Cu Chulainn in combat on the misty Isle of Skye, taught not only martial skill, but prophecy, a blend of warrior's art and druidic vision. Brigid, remembered centuries later as a Christian saint, likely began as a priestess of fire and fertility, her blessings shaping poetry and healing alike. These figures reveal that in Ireland, wisdom was not restricted to men. Where knowledge and discipline flourished, authority followed, regardless of gender. Centers of learning safeguarded their traditions. Young men bound for lore or for verse trained under masters who required flawless recall. Verses of lore, cosmology, genealogy, and ritual were repeated until they formed a second skin. Students might spend 20 years in training, enduring tests of endurance, fasting for visions, and learning to read the sky as if it were a book. Unlike in Gaul, where Roman decree had silenced these schools, here they flourished, producing generations of learned men and women who carried forward the continuity of the order. The great silver Gundestrup cauldron, unearthed far from Ireland but reflecting Celtic imagination, offers glimpses of this world. Panels depict antlered figures seated cross-legged, surrounded by animals, holding torques and serpents. Other scenes show warriors, sacrifices, and gods in processions. Though its exact origins are debated, the imagery mirrors themes found in Irish myth. A cosmos where gods, men, and beasts mingled, where sacrifice linked life to death and rebirth, and where the priestly figure stood as mediator. In the art of distant workshops, one sees reflections of the same sacred vision preserved in Irish story. At assemblies, Druids judged disputes and proclaimed laws. Their voices carried beyond tribal lines, binding communities through shared tradition. Honor price, restitution, exile, all were declared beneath the authority of sacred verse. Unlike Rome's magistrates, they spoke not from written codes, but from memory, weaving law and ritual into single breath. To defy their word was to risk not only dishonor, but exclusion from the rights that bound a man to his people. In Ireland, their power remained whole, their judgments unquestioned. The sagas also show them as masters of enchantment. They conjured mists to hide armies, stirred storms to wreck fleets, and changed their shapes into beasts or birds. Whether such feats were ever believed as literal, they capture the awe with which the people regarded their priests. Even when Christian scribes later copied the stories, they could not strip away the aura of wonder. Instead, they transformed Druids into sorcerers, acknowledging that their memory was too strong to erase entirely. Conflict sometimes arose between prophecy and kingship. A ruler might seek expansion, but his priests warned of disaster. In some tales, kings ignored them and fell. In others, obedience to vision preserved peace. This tension reveals their immense authority. Even the most powerful rulers hesitated before acting against their counsel. The balance of sword and staff, crown and chant, defined Irish politics as much as raids and alliances. In rural life, their presence was just as pervasive. Farmers sought their blessings before planting. Women consulted them for childbirth, warriors for healing of wounds. They knew the herbs of the fields, the chants that drove out fever, the prayers that calmed storms. Their wisdom was not confined to royal courts, but woven into the texture of everyday existence. The resilience of their order was aided by geography. Ireland lay beyond Rome's reach, a land of scattered kingdoms, but no roads cut by legions, no garrisons planted in stone forts. Isolation became protection. While Gaul and Britain were reshaped by empire, this island remained its own, preserving traditions long after they had been extinguished elsewhere. What in continental Europe had become folklore here remained living practice. Even so, change was inevitable. By the 5th century, new voices arrived across the sea, missionaries carrying crosses, monks carrying Latin prayers. Christianity did not immediately erase the Druids, but it challenged them. Confrontations followed. Some remembered in tales of miracle contests between saints and priests of the old order. Yet before that confrontation unfolded fully, the Druids of Ireland had already secured their place in memory. They had flourished for centuries beyond Rome, preserving the rituals, laws, and prophecies that elsewhere had vanished. Though Gaul had faded into twilight, Ireland remained apart. The Druids there continued to judge, to foretell, to tether kings to their land. They endured not as shadows or half-remembered figures, but as living authorities, shaping both myth and daily life. Their resilience ensured that when Rome was long gone, the stories of Ireland still sang with the voices of priests who spoke to gods beneath the open sky. The first rumours of the new faith reached Ireland not through conquest, but in whispers across the sea. Captives brought in from Britain muttered prayers to a god nailed upon a cross. merchants repeated stories of bishops and their strange rites, while sailors spoke of churches rising in cities along the Roman world. Unlike Gaul, no legion carried the gospel here. The old order faced its challenge not from armies, but from a faith that moved silently with traders, slaves, and exiles. In Patrick, the challenge took on a human form. Carried into Ireland as a boy in chains, he tended flocks under a grey sky, learning the language and customs of the people who had enslaved him. Years later, after escape and ordination, he returned across the water, no longer a captive, but a missionary. His arrival was remembered in tales as a confrontation between two worlds, the white-robed priests of Oak and Star, and the shepherd of Christ, armed with prayer and cross. Tara, seat of kings, held the story of that strife. On the night of Beltane, the land lay dark until the sacred fire crowned the hill. Yet far off, Patrick lit his paschal fire, and its glow broke the darkness. The Druids warned the High King that if the blaze was not quenched at once, it would never be extinguished. Soldiers tried to scatter the embers, but the fire endured, and in the telling, its light spread across the land. Whatever truth lies behind the tale, it captures the reality. The new faith announced itself not by stealth, but with defiance, daring the old order to resist. Conflict followed. Tradition remembered contests of miracles, where Druids summoned storms only for saints to banish them, or where curses met blessings in open trial. These scenes, recorded by Christian scribes, exaggerate and mythologize, yet they preserve the memory of struggle. Conversion was not smooth or bloodless. It was contested at courts and assemblies, in festivals and in families. But Christianity was cunning as well as bold. It did not sweep away the rhythm of the year. It clothed it in new meaning. Fires still flared on hilltops in spring, but they honored saints instead of gods. Samhain's night of wandering spirits was transformed into vigils for the holy dead. Brigid, whose name had long been tied to poetry and fertility, reappeared as an abbess, whose miracles shone with startling familiarity to older tales. The people did not abandon their customs overnight. They simply renamed them. And in renaming, the church absorbed the strength of what had come before. The Druids felt their ground slipping. Their authority had rested on memory, on the spoken word carried faithfully from master to pupil. Yet monks came with parchment and ink, offering permanence the priests of the grove could not match. Kings, eager for alliances with distant Christian realms, favored advisors who could send letters across seas or trace genealogies in script. The prestige of writing, combined with the aura of miracle, undermined the authority of those who spoke only from memory. Some priests bent to the change. Their children entered monasteries, becoming poets and jurists whose verses still carried fragments of the old law. Others resisted fiercely, casting curses at missionaries and warning of ruin. But resistance without swords could not hold. Bit by bit, the balance tipped. Kings patronized abbots. Courts leaned on monks to preserve records. The old order still flickered in prophecy and ritual, but its light grew dim beside the blaze of the cross. Still, even in defeat, the Druids shaped the world that replaced them. Their laws, carried for centuries in chant, were written down by Christian scribes. The Brean codes, though cleansed of explicit pagan names, still bore the marks of their authors: honor prices, restitution, sanctuary, exile. The structure of justice remained Celtic, even as its language turned Latin. In this way, the authority of the grove outlived its priests, hidden in ink but enduring. Legends, too, carried their shadow. In saints' lives, Druids appear again and again as adversaries. magicians casting storms or summoning darkness, always defeated by the power of Christ. These tales condemned them, yet also preserved them. Better to depict them as sorcerers than to forget them entirely. Even their enemies could not erase the awe that clung to their memory. By the 6th century, the tide had turned. Monasteries crowned the hills where sacred groves had once stood. Bells rang where chants had echoed. The kings who once sought the sanction of Druids now called upon abbots and bishops. The priesthood that had resisted Rome had finally yielded, not to empire, but to faith. And yet, the end was not silence. Their voice survived in law and custom, in festivals that carried their rhythm, in saints who bore their names, and in stories that refused to die. They were no longer the rulers of ritual, but neither were they forgotten. Their memory lingered, half shadow, half fire, carried forward into the age of monasteries and chronicles. When people gathered at Samhain to light fires against the dark, or sought healing at a spring dedicated now to a saint, they still touched something older than Christianity. The Druids had been driven from the courts of kings, but they remained in the marrow of the culture. Their twilight was not a clean break, but a long blending, a merging of voices where old chants echoed faintly beneath new prayers. And in that blend, their story did not end. It prepared the ground for legend, where Druids would step from the realm of history into the realm of myth. Figures who could not be destroyed by conquest or conversion, because they had already become part of the imagination of a people. Even as the priesthood lost its open power, stories clung to them like ivy on a fallen wall. In Ireland, where saints spread across the land, Druids did not vanish overnight. Their voices lingered in prophecy and song, their names woven into legends that blurred the line between history and imagination. In this long afterlife, they became figures of marvel and dread, half human, half myth, haunting the early medieval centuries like spirits unwilling to leave. The sagas are filled with such shadows. Cathbad, the seer of Ulster, appears not only as a counsellor, but as one who could shape destiny itself. It was he who foretold the tragic fate of Deirdre, whose beauty would unravel kingdoms. It was he who declared that Cu Chulainn would burn bright and die young. His words, once spoken, became inescapable, a reminder that prophecy itself could steer the course of a people. Other names burn even brighter. Mog Ruth, the wonder worker, was said to ride a chariot across the sky, wheels blazing, his cloak filled with the winds of heaven. Tales told that he blinded enemies with blasts of fire, conjured storms from the western sea, and travelled to lands beyond sight. Whether drawn from memory of a real priest or embroidered from the fabric of myth, Mog Ruith became the archetype of the Druid as magician, a figure who stood outside ordinary time. In Wales, too, echoes remained. Early poems remembered wise men who spoke with the voices of birds, who read omens in the flight of ravens, who held the knowledge of trees. Later generations would weave these fragments into the figure of Merlin, half prophet, half madman, whose counsel guided and tormented kings. Though Geoffrey of Monmouth would shape him into legend centuries later, the roots lay in older traditions where Druids had once stood beside rulers, speaking truths that could not be ignored. The Bandrui reappear in medieval accounts as seeresses, sometimes feared, sometimes revered. They prophesied at courts, brewed potions that healed or cursed, and guarded the liminal spaces between life and death. Even as the church tried to erase or recast them, their presence lingered in folklore. Wise women who lived at the edge of villages, guardians of herbs and secrets, descendants in memory, if not in name, of the priestesses who once stood beside kings. Christian scribes, eager to exalt their saints, often set them against these remnants of the old order. Lives of holy men recount contests with Druids, storms raised and banished, idols shattered, curses hurled and broken. In such stories, the priests of Oak are always defeated, yet the very need to stage such confrontations shows how present they still were in memory. Better to present them as vanquished sorcerers than to risk forgetting them altogether. In folk tradition, their legacy seeped into landscape. Villagers told of hills where fires must be lit each spring, rivers that demanded offerings before crossing, stones that were said to move on certain nights of the year. These customs no longer carried the authority of a recognized priesthood, but they preserved the rhythms once guarded by Druids. A man might call on St. Brigid rather than the goddess Brigid, yet the prayer was offered at the same well, the candle lit on the same day. Beneath new names, the old presence endured. They appeared in legend as voyagers across the boundaries of worlds. Some spoke of Druids who could take the shapes of animals, who walked into mist and never returned, or who rose from graves to speak warnings to the living. Others told of enchanted objects linked to their power, cauldrons that never emptied, spears that never missed, stones that glowed with hidden fire. These wonders were not just tales of magic. They reflected the belief that Druids held secrets no ordinary mortal could fathom, that they moved in realms of knowledge still half feared by those who told the stories. As centuries passed, the priesthood faded from daily life but grew larger in legend. The absence of living Druids created a vacuum that imagination filled with marvels. They became the wise men of old, the sorcerers who defied saints, the prophets whose words shaped kingdoms. Their survival in story was a testament to how deeply they had marked the people who once listened to them. Even Christian writers could not erase the sense of awe. Some admitted grudging respect, describing them as philosophers who once speculated on the soul and the stars. Others condemned them as servants of demons, but whether honored or reviled, they remained present, too deeply woven into the culture to vanish. The church might declare their groves cursed, but the memory of their chants still echoed in poetry and song. By the early Middle Ages, what remained of Druidry was no longer an institution, but a legendarium. Their schools were gone, their assemblies silenced, yet their names lived on in tales that entertained and instructed. They became warnings in saints' lives, marvels in folklore, and symbols of lost wisdom in poetry. In this form, they reached beyond the limits of their own age, entering the imagination of generations who never saw them in flesh but felt their presence in story. This was their last stronghold, not a fortress of stone, but the fortress of memory. In myths that mingled fact with wonder, Druids endured when armies, kings, and even empires had passed away. Their groves were ash, but their legends were green, sprouting anew each time a tale was told by the hearth, or a poem was sung in the hall. Out of this domain of tale, they emerge into the closing act of their journey, leaving behind the role of priest, entering instead the realm of myth and legend, where they would help shape the dreams of the medieval age. When the groves grew quiet and the last priests faded from courts and councils, their voices did not die. They moved into story. Memory, no longer clothed in white robes, began to walk in poetry, in saga, in the rhythm of verses recited beside hearths. The Druids who could no longer speak lore beneath oaks now shaped worlds within tales. Their wisdom turned into mythic fire. In the Irish tradition, these figures became inseparable from the great cycles of legend. A Mergin, stepping ashore with the Milesians, declared himself sea and wind, hawk and stag, sun and stone. His chant was not an observation, but a spell. a way of claiming the island by weaving himself into every element of its landscape. Through him, audiences felt the echo of an older belief that to name the world was to master it, that words themselves bent the fabric of creation. Other stories carry prophecy like a thread of iron through their plots. The seer Cathbad appears at critical moments, shaping destinies not with sword but with sentence. When he warns that a boy who takes arms on this day will die young, Cu Chulainn accepts the cost and seals his fate. To those who heard the tale, the lesson was unmistakable. The speech of the learned could bind a life more surely than chains. In these sagas, women also spoke with voices of power. They were remembered as teachers, as healers, as guardians of mysteries. Scathach, who trained heroes in combat, taught more than skill with spear. She foresaw outcomes, embedding martial prowess with the inevitability of fate. Others appear as wise women whose counsel kings ignored at their peril, or as figures who bridged the human and the divine, embodying the older role of sovereignty once invoked in rituals of kingship. Wales, too, kept fragments of this inheritance. Poems spoke of prophets who wandered forests, listening to streams and birds. Over centuries, these memories fused into the figure of Myrddin, who later emerged in European lore as Merlin. In early verse, he is no courtly magician, but a wild-eyed seer, half mad, half inspired, whose words spill like riddles. He is the Druid transformed into bard and prophet, reshaped for an audience who still longed for the voice of ancient wisdom, even as the church condemned it. Stories also remembered wonders linked to the old order, cauldrons that restored the dead to life, spears that never missed, stones that glowed within a fire. These marvels reveal how ritual implements, sacred vessels, weapons, and charms once used in ceremony, morphed into the treasures of legend. They were not described as relics of priests, but as gifts of gods. Yet the association endured. Power once drawn from ritual became mythic objects that lived in imagination long after the rites had ended. Even saints' lives, written by those who sought to erase pagan memory, kept Druids alive in shadow. They appear as adversaries, magicians conjuring storms, raising darkness or hurling curses, always defeated but always formidable. These depictions condemned them, yet also acknowledged their potency. To forget them was impossible. Better to recast them as foils than to let their image vanish. The bardic schools that flourished in medieval Ireland carried on their spirit under another name. Poets, trained in long recitations and skilled in preserving genealogies, held a place in society akin to the priests of old. Their verses replaced chants, their memory replaced ritual, but the role endured. To carry the past forward, to shape reputation, to speak truth in the cadence of poetry. In this way, the Druid transformed into bard, their wisdom stripped of ritual, but not of resonance. By the high Middle Ages, imagination had fully claimed them. Geoffrey of Monmouth's chronicles gave Europe its Merlin, counsellor to Arthur, prophet of Britain, inheritor of the mantle of Druidic memory. Though his figure bore little resemblance to historical priests, he embodied the same archetype, one who knew what others could not, who bound rulers to destiny, who spoke with authority that crossed the line between mortal and divine. Through myth, the Druids achieved a kind of immortality. They had lost their groves, their assemblies, their authority in law and kingship. Yet in story, they thrived. Children grew up with their names in poems. Warriors measured themselves against heroes shaped by their prophecy, and poets sang verses that carried echoes of chants once spoken beneath sacred trees. At last, the priesthood endured only within the imagination. There, unassailable by empire or church, they endured, no longer men of flesh, but voices of myth. Their wisdom lived on in riddles, in prophecy, in stories that shaped identity. When people spoke of Emergen's chant, Cathbad's prophecy, or Merlin's riddles, they were not recalling history alone, but carrying forward the memory of an age when priests walked among them and bound the world with words. The last shadows of the Druids flickered in the early medieval centuries, long after their groves had been cut and their assemblies dissolved. By then, they were no longer priests in white, but figures of memory, spoken of in sagas, feared in sermons, half-honored and half-condemned. Their eclipse was not a single moment of defeat, but a gradual dimming, until history no longer spoke their name, and only story carried their voice. Church councils thundered against them. Bishops denounced rituals at wells and fires, condemning them as remnants of pagan deceit. Charms and verses whispered by healers were labelled works of sorcery. To be accused of druidry was to be accused of heresy, a crime against God rather than an office of honour. Yet these condemnations, repeated in law codes and sermons, reveal how long their presence lingered in practice. Had memory truly vanished, there would have been no need to forbid it. In saints' lives, Druids appear as adversaries defeated by miracle. Patrick faces them at Tara, where their curses break before the cross. Other saints confront them in contests of storm and fire, always victorious, always proving the superiority of the new faith. These stories were propaganda, but they also testify to the resilience of memory. Even when portrayed as villains, the Druids were acknowledged as figures of formidable power, worth opposing, worth remembering. Over time, their image blurred further. In folklore, they became sorcerers haunting ruins, or wise men who could heal with herbs and curses alike. In poetry, they were recalled as sages of a golden age, keepers of knowledge now lost. Medieval chroniclers sometimes described them as philosophers who once speculated on the soul and the stars, placing them in the company of Greek sages. In other accounts, they were mocked as magicians led astray by demons. Reverence and scorn mingled, but in both, the memory of their presence remained. What made them endure was not accuracy, but imagination. People remembered them less as they were, and more as what they represented. A class that bound law to ritual, prophecy to kingship, community to cosmos. That memory survived not in records, there were none, but in the conviction that once, in the time of ancestors, there had been men and women who spoke with the voice of the world itself. In folk practice, the echo lingered longest. Fires still burned at midsummer. Wells still received coins and prayers. Mothers still whispered charms that bore fragments of verses once spoken in groves. The church tried to Christianize these customs, and often succeeded. But beneath the new language, the old rhythm pulsed. The people might not call their healers Druids, but the role was much the same. Mediators between life and mystery. As centuries passed, the word itself faded from daily speech, but legend refused to let go. In Ireland, poets and storytellers preserved their memory in sagas, where they remained seers and prophets. In Wales, fragments of prophecy transformed into the figure of Myrddin, later Merlin, who carried the druidic archetype into the heart of Arthurian legend. Across Europe, when people spoke of ancient wisdom, they often reached for the image of Druids, even if distorted by time. Their eclipse was therefore double. As a living institution, they were extinguished, outlawed by Rome, denounced by the Church, absorbed into new systems of law and learning. Yet as symbols they endured, reshaped to fit the needs of each age. To pagans, they were revered ancestors. To Christians, adversaries. To poets, fountains of lost wisdom. To later romantics, guardians of nature's secrets. They vanished in history, but grew immortal in imagination. The silence of their own voices is striking. They left no books, no inscriptions, no chronicles. Their lore and knowledge lived in memory alone, and when the chain of teaching was broken, much was lost forever. What we possess are only echoes. The verses preserved in sagas, the hostile descriptions of Romans, the condemnations of churchmen, the marvels of folklore. Out of these fragments we glimpse their outline, but the full figure is gone, like a great tree fallen and rotted, leaving only its roots beneath the soil. Perhaps that silence is fitting. The Druids built their authority on voice, on memory, on presence in the moment. To write was to fix, to confine. They preferred the living breath, the chant carried from teacher to pupil. Their disappearance into silence mirrors their own philosophy, that wisdom was not stone, but wind, not inscription, but echo. In the end, the Druids remind us of the fragility of memory and the strength of imagination. They were extinguished as a class, their groves felled, their schools closed. But they were never wholly forgotten. Their image lived on in saints' tales, in bardic poems, in the fires and wells of common folk, in the stories of Merlin and Emergin and Cathbad. They passed from history into legend, and from legend into symbol. Their final eclipse was not darkness, but transformation. Once they stood beneath oaks, speaking lore and prophecy. Later they walked only in story. Yet in that story, they achieved what no conqueror could deny them: endurance. The Druids remain not as a priesthood, but as an idea, the memory of a people who believed that words could bind the world, that lore could be sacred, and that the land itself spoke through human voices. The curtain falls. The Druids are no more, yet their shadows lie long upon the centuries. They survive where myth and memory entwine, not as masters of rites now lost, but as keepers of remembrance. Their groves are empty, yet their names endure. Their fires are darkened, yet their tales still shine.